Qualys has brought together vulnerability management and patch management, letting security teams discover vulnerabilities and apply patches immediately, all within a single, unified app. Sign up for a free trial of Qualys VMDR, vulnerability management, detection, and response today at securityweekly.com/Qualys. The average large enterprise has 24 million vulnerabilities. The good news is only 5% will probably be exploited. But which 5%? That's where Kenna comes in. Kenna Security's modern vulnerability management technology combines real-time threat intelligence, data science, and automated risk analysis to prioritize the vulnerabilities that pose the biggest threat to your organization. Team up with Kenna Security and make the most of your limited resources. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Kenna Security. The biggest problem in security that remains unsolved is flat networks inside the cloud and data center that allow threats to move laterally and compromise vulnerable targets. But microsegmentation using traditional firewalls is too complex and time-consuming. There's a better approach: Edgewise Zero Trust Auto Segmentation. Edgewise is impossibly simple microsegmentation. Using the identity of machines and software that are communicating, Edgewise offers the strongest protection that adapts automatically to changes. Protect any application in any cloud without any changes to your network by visiting securityweekly.com/Edgewise. Welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. In our October 22nd technical training, we will provide a look at a new free resource that delivers thousands of remedies as a service to bridge the gap between vulnerabilities found and vulnerabilities fixed. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or go to /on-demand, view the previously recorded webcasts. Chris Sanders is a security instructor, author, and consultant. He is the founder of Applied Network Defense and the director of the Rural Technology Fund. He is the author of Applied Network Security Monitoring and Practical Packet Analysis. His research is focused on the intersection of cognitive psychology and security investigations. Chris, welcome to Paul's Security Weekly.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. Chris, how'd you get your start in information security?
Well, I guess it all started when my cousin built a meth lab, which I think we talked about a little bit when I was last on the show.
I was going to say, wait, you've been on the show before. After I asked that question, I realized you've been on the show.
Yeah, I was like, Paul.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know what, Chris? Tell the story again, because it's fun.
Yeah, it's a great story because it begins with my cousin building a meth lab.
Like, right? You can't leave our audience hanging that hasn't listened to the first interview.
Well, no, he built a meth lab. Started, this is in Kentucky, so he was doing redneck chemistry without a degree. Of course, got caught because that's what happens when you build meth labs in West Kentucky, and went to prison. Got interested in some computer classes when he was in prison. Got out of prison eventually, and then he was my cousin, so I was at his house, my aunt's house, and so on, and taught me a little bit about computers, and it kind of all snowballed from there. I got interested on my own, eventually moved into security, and then the rest was kind of history.
I'm glad you didn't say it 8-balled from there.
Well, no,
different.
I think I said this last time. I'm like, had he not gotten caught and you learned how to build meth labs, you might not be here right now. You might be somewhere else, not in security.
I would probably be where he ended up, which is not a great place.
Yeah. So, Chris, what did you want to dig into? Intrusion Detection Honeypots, Detection Through Deception. Tell us about that.
So that is my new book. I happen to have a copy right here because I don't leave home without one, even though I am home now.
You know what? No one should leave home without one, by the way.
That's really why I'm here. If you've left home without your Intrusion Detection Honeypots book, then I don't know what you're doing with your life.
That's right. What gave you the idea to write the book?
So I've been using honeypots for a long time, and really honeypots have a little bit of a bad name, right? Most people think a honeypot is basically a device that I'm going to put outside my network firewall, and it's really just kind of for fun, for catching whatever happens to be floating around the internet at the time, catching random malware samples, building random password lists of people trying to log into services, and sure, that can be a honeypot, but I've had a lot of success using honeypots for intrusion detection purposes. So taking very low interaction, specifically purposed honeypots, putting those inside the network, and basically using those as a very high efficacy way to catch bad guys breaking in. I've had a lot of success with that. I know there's a few select people who have done some of this, but it just doesn't get talked about a lot. Part of that is because honeypots kind of have some of that baggage like I talked about. Part of it's because honeypots are inherently deceptive, and when people are being deceptive, they're a little cagey about talking about it.
I think would term those as deception. Is that, I mean, does it fall into that realm, or like what gives it the moniker of honeypot rather than deception-based technology? Or in your world, is that the same thing?
I mean, I think deception-based technology can cover a lot of things. Honeypot is really one of those. I think probably the more predominant kind of it, but the subtitle of the book is Detection Through Deception, so it certainly is something I place in that category.
I gotcha. While there are a lot of commercial products that do this, your book focuses on open source things and things you can build yourself, I would assume?
Yeah, correct. There's some great products out there that are doing this, and I do mention a couple in the book, just kind of in passing, but I really wanted the book to be something people could take and just immediately get going with stuff. So everything I talk about in the book, and I go through about a dozen or more specific techniques. It's all stuff that can be done just with whatever you have, or some scripts which I provide and are available to download.
That's awesome. Along those lines, Haroon Mir, who is just an awesome person. Many of us know Haroon. Built a great, company at Thinkst. Did you cover Canary, because that is free and open source?
Yeah, and I got to say, I'm a big fan of Haroon. I'm a big fan of Thinkst and the work they're doing. I first wrote about intrusion detection honeypots as a concept in my 2013 book, Applied Network Security Monitoring. Back then, nobody was really doing it. And at some point I said, well, eventually somebody is going to come along and commercially do this, and there's going to be a lot of people doing it wrong, and there are going to be a few people doing it really, really right. And I think what Haroon is doing is one of the folks who are doing it right. They're doing it how I would do it. So they were a big supporter of the book. Marco, who works with Haroon, was one of the technical editors for the book. Okay. Good. So they provided some feedback, and I do cover Open Canary, their free open source version, in there, as well as their Honey Tokens website.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are some of the other open source technologies, Chris, that you cover? So
a lot of what I'm covering is actually stuff you can kind of do just with built-in tools, like just with Windows. So, I talk about Honey Documents, for instance, where you're actually just taking a Word document and you're embedding a URL in there, basically linking to an image that's out on the internet. The idea being that an attacker breaks into your network, they find this document that's passwords.xls or something like that, and either they open it straight up or they exfiltrate it out, then they open it. The document tries to make a call out to this URL, which is actually on a public web server that you own. So then you're actually getting notified that they've opened that document. So stuff like that, it's really just using built-in tools. So for the most part, everything. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Chris. In your Office document example, that doesn't have to be a macro, right? You can embed that right in the XML of the document.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's awesome.
So pretty easy. So most of the stuff I'm covering is similar to that. It's a lot of just built-in stuff. In many places, I'm using like PowerShell scripts to automate it, because there are a few things that we want to do, like things with Honey broadcasts, for example, where we're sending out doing things that would cause LLMNR broadcasts, so that if an attacker's on your network and they're running something like Responder, well, we can periodically send those broadcasts, and when they receive one of them, we can send them fake credentials, essentially Honey credentials. The idea being that we're monitoring for the use of those.
Gotta love that.
In your monitoring, as well as sending out the broadcast using PowerShell scripts?
Yeah, it's one script that sends it out, and then when that attacker interacts with that and they try to send an authentication request to that host, that's when you reply with the fake credentials.
Gotcha.
Does that script have the ability to like hook into something like Beats or Sysmon, where those get pushed back to like a central like SIM? So that those
so
go out
that's an important question, because I mean the whole point of intrusion detection honeypots is we hadn't notified of the stuff, right? If an attacker interacts with one of these things, we want to know what happened. So basically every honeypot I cover in the book, I have a monitoring section for it, and it's basically how to get alerts out of this thing, how to feed this into what is probably already an existing alerting infrastructure that you have, generate those logs, get them in there and do alerting. So this provides basically a log file, a simple text entry that you could plug into Beats or Syslog or whatever else is getting to the people that are going to respond to it.
Does it also cover, when you're saying a lot of the honeypots you're building, is that covering some of the Active Directory honeypot stuff too?
Like, what do you
mean? Something like Kerber roasting, where you're setting up like a honey token for, because Kerber roasting is really hard to detect, right? And so the ability to have a special SPN that, if you hit it with inside of AD, obviously that triggers.
Yeah, so that's a good technique. I didn't cover that one in the book. I do a lot of honey credentials in general, not that in specific, but the notion of different ways you can set up fake credentials and then monitor for their use. So the LLMNR broadcast is certainly one of those, some strategies for just throwing those credentials around in places. One of the techniques that I really like is basically injecting fake credentials in memory. So if someone compromises a machine, they're going to do something like running Mimikatz to dump credentials that are on the system. They would dump the credentials that you've put that are fake, and of course, then they're going to try to use them, and you would be monitoring for that.
That's pretty cool. Would those credentials be injected via something like a GPO as part of like a startup PowerShell script, or how's that injection happening?
Yeah, so in this case, it's just a script, and it's basically using a trick where you can launch a command prompt window using a user account and password that doesn't actually exist. So it's kind of automating that process. It's hiding that window using just a PowerShell hidden window trick. And the attacker, if they're really looking hard, they might see that there's a cmd.exe instance that's running, and maybe they wonder why it's there. But at that point, they've probably already done their damage, and hopefully you'll know they're there.
So you're covering a lot of the high level like creative and theory part of how to like get this going, and then the scalability part is, here's some tips and tricks how to scale this and use this in a little bit larger situation.
To some degree, where possible, I want to give folks like scripts to make it easy where they can just kind of go with it, tweak it, and so on. I will say I wrote this book a little bit more, well, not maybe more, but equally as much with smaller business in mind. One of my big issues is intrusion detection. Anytime anybody talks about it, all they want to talk about is scaling it up. And how do we make this work for the Fortune 500s or for the DoD or governments or whatever? The little guy kind of gets left behind when it comes to intrusion detection and making it feasible. The good thing about intrusion detection honeypots, the general premise is that nobody should ever talk to a honeypot. You tune out some basic false positives like some scanners and some things like that, and you're left with really high efficacy detection that doesn't have a lot of false positives really at all. And if it does, they're very easy to investigate. It's a phone call or something like that. So by leveraging that, this is detection that scales down really, really well. So small companies that maybe don't have a dedicated security person, maybe a sysadmin could do this, or even better, a lot of these companies are using MSPs to manage their tech. They could deploy some of these things at scale really easily. So I wrote this book and kind of wrote about a lot of these techniques with small business in mind more than a lot of other things too.
I think that's way better. Does that play into your kind of rural technology fund mantra so that it applies to that?
I mean, a little bit. I mean, it's also a numbers game because, 90% of Americans are employed by small businesses. I mean, we think about the big businesses because that's where all the money is. And if you're like an enterprise software company, that's where you're going to make the big bucks. But it's not just about corporate money and that level. It's about individuals. It's about people. It's about, securing the things that make the world work. And a lot of that's small business.
That's awesome, man.
So Chris, you talk about, setting things up for different size business. Are you also setting it up for different levels of ability? It sounded like it, just getting started as opposed to the more advanced stuff and step trips for success.
Different levels of ability in terms of like practitioner ability.
Yeah. I know that I'm not talking about a pot full of honey to somebody who's really, really quite advanced in their IT and IDS type skills. What's your range? Who are you targeting?
So I try to target a pretty broad range, and I go into each one of these honeypots. Like I mentioned the example earlier of an Excel document where it's got the embedded link, and I show the process of doing that. And a lot of people with not a ton of technical knowledge could create that thing, but I also go out and talk about, you can also go to Think's Canary Tokens website and they'll create one for you. Like it's an automated type deal. So part of the knowledge is part of the goal is arming people with the knowledge they need to be successful kind of wherever they're at. For some people, that's creating all this stuff manually from scratch and implementing all these scripts. Other people, it's relying on free but easier stuff like the Think's Open Canary and whatnot. For some people, it's just arming them with the knowledge they need to go out and find a commercial solution, a commercial honeypot solution, like Think's products as well, and then knowing how to have that conversation with them and how to place those on the network. Because
Chris,
just buying isn't enough.
In your example, if you were to put that type of honey token inside of a document, You also need a server on the internet to be able to catch that request to that image file, and you have to monitor that, right? I feel like that's the bigger portion because I mean it's pretty straightforward to, put something inside of a document, right? John Strand and I talked about that, years ago, in the various ways in which to do that. The harder part is setting up and maintaining infrastructure, and the monitoring and alerting when that does happen, right?
I mean, it depends. If we're talking bigger businesses, they're already doing monitoring and alerting.
Well, sure, yeah. I meant for the small business.
For the smaller businesses, to some degree, yes. I mean, you figure most of these businesses at some point are going to be interacting with web servers. So the notion of setting up a web server, I don't think is too intimidating to most folks, especially with cloud resources now available.
Sure.
I'm recommending people host these on those and not on their own infrastructure. So I don't think that's too difficult. I think most people, we're talking again more sysadmins than security folks here, are pretty comfortable doing that. Now, getting alerts from it, that can get a little bit tricky. It depends on. I provide some strategies as far as like working with what you have, and for some people, that's just generating email alerts, sending some type of syslog catch or something like that. That does get a little bit trickier. You're right.
Well, and that might not be tricky to set up, but making sure that it's working is where I have concerns, right? So here I set the server up, and I'm like, hey, if anyone requests this URL, send me an email. But the process that sends that an email, maybe it stops working at some point. And again, as you stated, Chris, these are low efficacy things. It may only send me an email once or twice a year with someone that opened up a document, right? How do I know if it's really sending email? So do you recommend like a regular heartbeat so that you can check in on that? Or is it just better due diligence process to go check in on those things? Are there automated things that can help people with that?
Well, I would say, how would you make sure any other service in your network is running? And that's generally by some type of testing it. So, setting up something that automatically pings this URL every now and then, some type of watchdog service that's making sure these things are up and running.
Yep.
Most organizations are doing some of this, particularly, again, going back to small businesses. Most of the really small ones are managed by MSPs who are already doing a lot of this stuff anyway,
right? Because
they want to know what it goes down before the customer goes down, or else they're going to lose their business, right? So I think these things are generally pretty easy to integrate into whatever folks are doing there.
Yeah, I wonder, are folks using like Nagios or Zabbix or whatever the new Nagios is? I went down that rabbit hole once.
People are still using Nagios.
Yeah, okay.
And new versions, but still.
Nothing wrong with that.
Well,
it ain't broke.
I wouldn't say nothing, but
No. How about if it ain't broke and it fits the budget?
Yeah, there you go. If it meets your requirements, most of them, I find with Nagios. What else is in the book, Chris?
So, I mean, it's a lot of those types of things. The way I tried to figure this, I mean, the last half of the book, or the last 2/3-ish, is all about the different types of honeypots. Before we get there, I kind of want to set the stage a little bit. So right off the bat, I talk a little bit about the history of honeypots, which I think is kind of fascinating. It's a history that begins with the name Cliff Stoll, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with.
I was going to say, is Clifford Stoll, your first reference to that?
Yeah, he's as far as I know and can find, he was really the first person to implement a honeypot, and his is really closer to what I'm talking about than what most people know honeypots for.
I think I am at that point right now in the Cuckoo's Egg.
Are you just now reading the Cuckoo's Egg?
Well, so I don't read books, I do audiobooks. So Cuckoo's Egg hadn't been available on audiobook for the longest time, and it's only been fairly recently available. And my kids and rest of the family have taken to reading audiobooks. So when they're in the car with me, I have to listen to something else. When I'm in the car by myself, I get to listen to the Cuckoo's Egg. So
if I would have known this, you'd have called me, I would have read the Cuckoo's Egg to you. Like, this feels like something you need to have read.
Wait, is that a service that you provide, Chris?
Because I mean,
I could.
I wonder if we can afford it.
Yeah, that's the trick.
Well, see, because I'm wondering, because we have TCP/IP Illustrated Volume 4, and I haven't read that either. So
it's hard to do like fun voices when you're reading like packet headers.
I was going to say, yeah, packet dumps and headers could get tricky. Yeah.
Well, I mean, if you did packet dump, you just have to make it sound like you're taking a dump. Like, oh, did you do it? 450.
I don't know that you'd have to do that. It is an option available.
I mean, you pay extra for that.
Okay. Chris, many of the deception vendors have this concept of like a decoy, which is an actual service or process that runs. do you cover like actually running and or emulating some type of service, or is it more limited to the other style of kind of honeypot or honey token technology, right, which is embedding it into things that already exist?
So we do talk about some services. I have a chapter on honey services as well. So we talk about one of the popular tools is Cowrie for SSH honeypots.
Yep.
So I talk about using that. I talk about, the Open Canary tool is more of a service thing. I do an example in the book where I show how to run Open Canary to do an RDP honeypot for remote desktop. And then I also show you how to set it up using just Windows, using the actual remote desktop protocol, but configuring it to where nobody can actually log into it by messing around with permissions and ACLs and things like that. So I do talk about services. I generally don't get any more high interaction than that. This is what a lot of people are afraid of with honeypots is they're like, well, I don't want to take an intentionally vulnerable system and sit it in on the inside of my network. And that's not what we're doing here. Generally, we're focusing on low interaction, and interaction is a key thing here because you don't need a lot to know the attacker's there. If they've scanned something, if they've browsed to it, if they've attempted to log in, they're there. Now, there are some benefits to higher interaction. Most folks are not really ready for that. I've talked to a lot of folks who are doing some really cool things with super high interaction honeypots where they can selectively feed attackers pathways to go down and kind of interact and see what tools and tradecraft they're using. That's not going to be applicable to most people, so I didn't talk about a lot of that.
Gotcha. Do you find in that case, are some people using Docker containers to do that?
I think in some cases, particularly in larger organizations where they need the ability to spin these things up really, really quickly and in mass and in a lot of places.
My concern with that is I question the security of Docker to do that.
I mean, it's another layer, right? And my philosophy is I need my honeypot to be as simple as humanly possible, and that's it. Like I don't want any more complexity than I need. And I demonstrate that the very first honeypot we build in the book is just using Netcat to build an HTTP honeypot. It'll serve up a web page. It's not actually over HTTP, but the attacker doesn't know that. It's keeping it relatively simple because, again, the idea is once someone interacts with that honeypot, which no one should ever do, they're there and you can begin the investigation. And that's really the bulk of the battle as far as detection is concerned.
Hey, Chris, Ed Scotus called and he wants his honeypot back. I love
Fair
Ed.
enough.
I love Ed.
That's the man.
Don't we all?
Yes, we do. Sorry.
Lee?
So I was wondering, you talked about honeypots built on Windows as well as other Unix derivatives. Where you have a feel on which platform is the most successful, or what kind of a balance you need in terms of successfully luring and detecting unwanted activity?
It depends a little bit on the network. So I talk about placement and how to plan honeypots. And, there are two main strategies. One is what I call an outside-in strategy, where the attacker is likely to come from the edge of the network and move in towards the most sensitive assets. So in this case, the common footholds are probably going to be like your end user workstations, right? They're sending phishing emails, they're getting people to click on links, and those are probably going to be Windows. Now, your sensitive assets, this is more of an inside-out approach. Those are often going to be Linux or Unix-based stuff. Not always, but often. So it really depends on what you're trying to protect. I think you should use both in most cases if you're resourced for it. It's really easy to do a lot of stuff with Windows endpoints just because there's a lot of attack surface, I guess, to work with, and a lot of the end user tools that are used on there. But there's cool stuff you can do in Linux too. I talk about honey commands, right, which are super cool. Let's say you've got a group of sysadmins who manage a group of really critical database servers, and they have to edit config files, and that everyone who edits config files in your network uses Nano because they're all well-adjusted, perfectly sane people, and that no one would ever use VI or Vim.
Oh my God! I just opened my mouth a little bit.
Welcome to Fantasy Island.
Did he really just say that?
So
the first thing I would do is I would alias Nano to VI. That's the first thing I would do.
Well, no, you're on the right track, because what you do now is, since nobody's ever using VI, you create an alias so that anytime someone runs VI, it's actually running a bash script that sends you an alert that tells you someone's running VI.
See, that's when I'm the attacker and I'm just RM-RFing the whole thing. Take away my VI and raise it Nano.
Hey, that's fine because they're there at that point.
Well, no. So Chris's point is that you don't redirect VI to Nano. you redirect VI to VI, but it's a shell script that says,
okay.
"Danger, Will Robinson." Here's
Yeah,
VI.
like they won't know. I mean, there's ways they could figure it out, but for the most part, they're going to run VI and they're going to get VI. They're not going to know that in parallel there's a shell script running that's telling me what's going on.
I gotcha.
And you can do that with any command. I mean, I use that example because
alias RM-FR to.
Yeah, for that matter, I can alias RMRF and just have it send Paul an email every time someone does that.
Paul gets enough email already.
Yes, I do.
Well, I think you just have to, alias Emacs to RM-RF/.
I saw a great poll the other day.
That's
Wait,
the
what?
best idea I've heard all year.
Yeah. So Joff, you probably may have seen it. I saw a great poll in Slack the other day that was, "What's your favorite editor?" VI. And
that was the only option.
That was the only option.
That's awesome. My kind of poll.
All right, now that we've established that.
Wow.
Hey, you want to be stumped, Chris?
This feels like a trick question.
I think it already was a trick question. That was your first trick question.
And
what,
for his
if any
next trick,
PCI requirement would a honeypot apply to?
Can you say that again? I heard PCI requirement.
What, if any, PCI requirement or requirements could a honeypot be used to satisfy or meet?
I have no idea. I'm stumped. You've succeeded.
I'm going to
that
say
was easy.
breach disclosure, because when I get breached, I'm just going to say it was a honeypot. I wouldn't pass PCI.
No, you wouldn't.
No. We're waiting.
Well, we'll just leave that hanging out there.
Now we have to go read the PCI standard.
Nope.
Was that question a honeypot to make us go read the PCI standard?
No, it was an
It ain't
excuse
working.
to
It ain't
drink.
working.
That's all.
We don't need excuses to drink.
I hadn't meant 11.4.
11.4.
Which is
Intrusion detection and/or intrusion prevention techniques to detect and/or prevent intrusions into the network.
Is 11.5 the pen test requirement?
No, 11.3 is the pen test. 11.5
I was close.
is
I
pilot.
knew it was.
You were close.
You were right
You
there.
just went the wrong direction.
I did. Damn it.
Yep.
You're
familiar with
question.
the pen test.
Chris, have you ever seen honeypots deployed using BSD jails? Ooh, I love Tyler's reaction.
I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I've heard of the concept, right? And I think that's what the whole evening with Burford thing, like the thing that happened in the early '90s, where he did some stuff with that. I think that was. I talked about that briefly in the book, but not anything beyond that.
That's Cheswick and Bellevin, by the way, Paul.
Yeah.
Yes. I know some people that are working on that. That's why I say that. And they're Armenian like me, and they're my new friends. And hopefully we'll hear more about what they're doing, because that's their kind of take on deception. Is I was like, wait, what? And they were like, oh yeah, like D-Trace and BSD jail. I'm like, oh, very nice. They did the CTF this weekend that I was putting out in our some of our Discord channels. So
It's awesome. Well, I tell you, the thing about deception and like utilizing it for network defense, once you start kind of thinking that way, you can't really unthink that way. And there's so many ways to do it. I interviewed a ton of people when I was researching the book. I interviewed probably about 80 people, and I probably heard 30, 40, 50 different techniques. I only could cover like 15 in the book that I thought were really accessible and really well thought out and really would work for a lot of people. But there are a ton of techniques out there, and kind of part of my hope for the book is that this is going to take something that people are kind of doing in secret or not talking a lot about. They'll start talking about it more, blogging about it, doing all the things that happen. And someone else will come along and write the next version of this book, and it'll have, 100 techniques in it, because there's so many ways you can go with this.
That's someone being Mr. Chris Sanders for Volume 2?
We'll see.
So did you happen to interview Mr. Tom Liston by any chance?
I try not to poke Tom too hard. No, yeah, I talk. You can't talk to honeypots without thinking about Tom a little bit.
Yeah.
He somehow made it.
Of course.
He's
or whipped cream and chocolate, but
that's true. He's made it into like the last 3 of my books and a reference, and like I feel like I should pay him. Don't tell him this. I feel like I should pay him royalties or something at some point. I'm not going to, but
It's the thought that counts, Chris.
yeah, it's the thought.
Dear Mr. Liston, Mr. Sanders says you should know.
Well, I guess famously, I think I may have gotten the job at Guardians back in the day because I was on the interview and Tom was on the call, and I mentioned that I was interested in honeypots back then, and he's like, "Well, have you seen my honeypots?" And I was like, "Yeah, they're all right." And I kind of, I didn't mean to, but I just kind of dismissed them, and everyone thought that was hilarious, and then I got hired.
That's awesome.
Tom did the La Brea Tar Pits?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yep. He's an amazing man.
Tom's the man. He's a good dude.
Yep.
Do you cover La Brea Tar Pits in your book, Chris?
No, I kind of bracket that out separately. You know, I talk about the research honeypots we've talked about. I talked about intrusion detection honeypots, which is the focus of the book. And then I bracket out this category called resource exhaustion honeypots. The general idea is that you get the attacker in there and you basically just tie up their resources and keep them busy. So that's what La Brea does. That's kind of what Cliff Stoll did to some degree with SDINet. John Strand obviously does a lot of that stuff.
I was going to say, yeah, John has one where you traverse the file system infinitely.
Web Labyrinth. Yeah, I think that's one of them.
Web Labyrinth is a different one, but yeah, there's a Windows file system one, and then Web Labyrinth is the other one. Ben Jackson did a lot of work on that too. Yeah.
Nice.
So those can be used for detection, obviously, if you're using them that way. But I kind of bracket out the resource exhaustion thing as its own deal.
That's cool.
Neat.
Chris, where should after you buy the book and read the book, right, and then you want to go implement it on your network? Where should people start if you've got no kind of honeypot or deception technology and you want to set this stuff up? Like, what are your first considerations and what are kind of your first steps to having a successful project?
You know, I think so. The thing I talk about in the book is thinking deceptively. There's three things: see, think, do. If you control what the attacker sees, you control what the attacker thinks. You ultimately control what they do. Right? Simple as that. That means we're putting honeypots in a place where people can see them. Bad guys, so we know where they're going to be. That's where it helps to have a little red team experience or talk to someone who does. So the attackers will see the thing. They need to think it has value, so it needs to look valuable in some way. And if those two things happen, the attacker will interact with it. I think the easiest way for that to happen for most people is honey documents, right? It's the Word document. It's the Excel document, passwords.xls. It's putting that on, start simple, right? Do it for your own stuff, right? Wherever you keep your sensitive files, put it in there. If you're doing it for your users, you can put it in subfolders where they keep their important stuff. You can also put it on map drives and then use the registry to hide those map drives. I show you how to do that. I think this is the easiest way to go about it. You can create the documents yourself using what I show you in the book. You can go to Thinks and use their free Open Canary site, and it'll create the documents for you if you want to go even easier. But I think that's probably the simplest gateway into intrusion detection honeypots. And it also helps shatter this notion that a honeypot has to be this really high interaction, hard to maintain system. Honeypot can be a system, it can be a service, it can be data. Data is, I think, where the most promise lies and where most people don't think about honeypots in the way they should. So that's where I would start.
Chris, if we kind of leveled the playing field, so to speak, in terms of the information about honeypots and deception technology is available to attackers and defenders exactly the same. So the techniques that we talk about are basically ones that attackers could look for, or is it in the customization and just the fact that someone may trip over one, right? Or does it kind of render it somewhat not useless, but not as effective because the attackers now are aware of all these techniques?
I don't really think so. I mean, yeah, certainly a lot of these honeypots, attackers, once they have interacted with them, they're going to know it's a honeypot. But once they've interacted with them, I know they're there anyway. So that's fine. Now, there's this notion that, okay, once an attacker realizes they're in a honeypot, they'll know that we know.
Yep.
And they may change their tactics around a little bit. And that's something I think we talk about a lot in InfoSec that doesn't actually happen that much. Particularly, attackers, we talk a lot about now how attackers live off the land. Well, there's only so much land to go around, right? There's only so many things that are already there that they can use. And so just because they realize they're in your honeypot, it doesn't mean they can necessarily very easily just change every single thing they're doing or that they even would. So I don't worry about that too much. And even if they do, I still know they're there so I can start responding. And if they're changing things, that means it's slowing them down from reaching their goal. So it's buying me time to do the things I need to do to eradicate them from the network.
Yeah,
Tyler,
that kind of plays.
You were kind of nodding your head
into,
like you've been caught by a honeypot or deception technology before.
Have
Be
I?
honest. Yeah, be honest.
No, not to date. I've found
That
a
he
couple
knows of.
honeypots, but they were just not well deployed. I mean, Chris is spot on right there. From an attacker standpoint, you have to do certain actions, right? You have to laterally move. You have to leverage credentials. You are looking through files. There are certain system actions that inherently, as you know, you're looking through technology, you're doing an engagement or an operation, like those require actions. You can't just sit on a system all day and not do anything. And those actions, if that honeypot is kind of well done or well documented, will often lead to that time to detection. So that time to detection and time to remediation threshold, that delta between those two, is the ultimate goal for all organizations, no matter what size. And so being able to deploy that and have that visibility, which a lot of places, even large corporations, do not have, if you're able to gain that visibility and then have that delta, because the important piece is you've got the detection part, but what is your response plan? What is your remediation? How do you go about removing that attacker? So that time to detection, time to remediation, having that in play makes a big step for most organizations. If you don't have any visibility, then obviously that's a real big problem. But like Chris said, if there is a honeypot there, as an attacker, we have certain actions to do, and it's very difficult for us to tell until we've either stumbled across it or we have some sort of indicator that from a document or something left behind by someone that was being lazy. There's really no good way to do actions and know prior to that if it's a honeypot or if it's real, if it's done right.
It's fun. When I was doing my research, I talked to probably a dozen pen testers who had been caught by honeypots. And I'll just say, as a blue team guy, I loved it. Like, I just wanted to bottle all their tears and just bathe in it, because it was you don't often get to hear from attackers who got caught in such fun ways. But I did, and it was great.
Didn't need that visual, but a colorful analogy nonetheless.
You have it now. You're welcome.
You know what Paul will be dreaming about tonight.
And but I mean, and I tell you, a lot of the way I spent most of my life on the blue team, except for a couple years I spent within Guardians doing red team work, and that really helped crystallize a lot of the concepts for me because I got to get hands-on experience doing that. And what I realized was, pretty much any time I got access to an endpoint, like a user endpoint, I was probably going to do one of three things. One, I would probably try to pillage that and look for any sensitive documents on it. Well, that's an opportunity for honey documents like we've talked about. Another thing I was going to do, if I don't have a high enough level of access, I'm going to try to steal credentials in some way. Well, that's a good use case for honey credentials injected into memory. So when I use Mimikatz or whatever, it's going to dump them, or honey broadcast, another way to get those credentials, honeypot opportunity. The third thing, if I have credentials, well, I'm going to start trying to look to move laterally. And I'm going to do that by scanning the network. Well, if I have something set up on the network listening for scanning activity, well, that's a honeypot as well. So what I realized effectively was the three things I'm going to do every time, there's kind of a honeypot answer to all of them. Powerful stuff.
Yeah. There's a honeypot answer for everything.
The first thing I did when I got access to an endpoint was the root dance. But
well, fair enough. After you look at all your friends and say, I got in, and then you have to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, that is one of the few things that does kind of keep red teamers up at night. That detection in your toolkit or TTPs getting set up to whatever cloud sourcing there is there. That always is a big concern. But the second is tripping some sort of honeypot or an alarm. Like, really, that's the ultimate suck. And so really having those in those key areas, which is very accurate, the way in which we move, and like you said, the way in which those key things that we do, we have to do all the time. That's the whole goal of, kind of what we do. So the level of stealth sometimes doesn't even matter. But the level of opportunity for the blue team to make those detections is pretty high when done right.
It's an exciting thing too, because there are a few opportunities as a defender. I get to use psychology against the attacker. And again, from my time doing red teaming, you're spending all this time, trying to break into these systems, and it's not like a hacker movie. It's very boring, right? It's I have this script and I'm changing one character, I'm running again, and I'm doing this for 8 hours straight. And I'm so desperate to get to the next level or get to the next thing. anything I see that looks at all like it might be valuable to me, I want it to be real. I'm hungry. I'm thirsting for this thing to be the thing that gets me into the network.
I always look for the garbage file. I don't know why.
Son of a bitch.
And so, but when you're that desperate to some degree, or when you're wanting something to be the thing that gets you to the next level so bad, you're going to overlook a lot of things. You're not going to pay as much attention as maybe you should. And this is why, even when things may even somewhat obviously be honeypots, this is when even very skilled attackers are going to stumble over these things, interact with them, and you're going to know what they're there. So again, it's one of the few opportunities as defenders we get to use psychology against attackers because we control the turf that they're working on.
Chris, are there things that we can and should do to prevent a honeypot or deception technology to be used against us?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, going back to what I said earlier, keep your honeypots as simple as they can be. It is very tempting to want to deploy a, vulnerable version of Windows XP onto your network and just deck it out with all the monitoring you can because eventually it'll get popped. However, at some point when it gets popped, however hard you try to lock it down, someone's going to probably use it to pivot and use it against you. I generally avoid high interaction honeypots inside the network. So I just avoid that level of interactivity. All you need to know is that the attacker interacted with it, and you'll get some information with that depending on what it is, whether it's an IP address, it's a username, something like that. That's really all you need to know. That's when you rely on your other existing logging and monitoring infrastructure for the next steps in the incident response and so on. So I think that's the key, is just limiting interactivity and not trying to use those full-blown systems to do this type of stuff.
More questions for Chris?
Paul, I have a question for Chris on your behalf because I've had an opportunity to learn from Chris quite a bit over the years. But any good barbecue tips?
Oh, I've got so many barbecue tips.
I know you do. Would that be the subject of your next book, perhaps?
Now, Chris, I got to ask, what kind of smoker? Is it an offset? Is it a pellet? Is it charcoal? What are you working with? It sounds like if you're really into barbecue, it's offset.
Sorry,
there's
Chris,
no other kind of smoker than offset smoker.
Chris,
Or
he has
55-gallon drum cut in half.
Right.
Chris, he has no idea.
So I have two smokers. One is it's on a trailer. It's
I was gonna say,
reverse.
Yeah.
It's a reverse flow offset, and it's I can fit about 150-pound hog on it.
Wow, that's
Give or take.
awesome.
And then I've got a pellet smoker for
Do you ever drive it to Rhode Island?
Yes, please do.
I can just drive it to Rhode Island and on the way dramatically read the cuckoo's egg and record it for you guys.
Yeah. How many?
Exactly.
Wait.
While you're driving.
How many briskets can you fit on the one that?
There's more.
How many briskets can you fit on the one on the trailer?
It depends on how much they weigh, but I mean, I could fit 30, 40.
Oh my God! Wow, that's awesome.
December 10th.
Yes,
Rhode Island.
come to Rhode Island.
Y'all come to me. The good barbecues in
Here we come.
Uh-huh.
Road trip.
What kind of wood you using, or does it depend on the kind of meat?
It depends a little bit, but for the most part, I generally blend. So I want a dense hardwood for heat, and then I want something fruity for flavor. So generally, I'm using oak or pecan for heat, and usually what I can get around here are cherry or apple or peach for flavor. I don't do a lot of mesquite. I don't do a lot of hickory. They're a little strong for my taste, but generally, yeah, like one kind of benign hardwood and one fruit wood.
That's actually really good advice. We're gonna have to talk more about barbecuing, Chris. I need to pick your brain.
Man, I tell you, I'm always glad to talk barbecuing anytime. It's you think I like honeypots? I mean, yeah, forget honeypots. Barbecue is where it's at.
That's awesome. It's awesome. So, Chris, people can find the book on Amazon, I'm assuming.
Yep, it's on Amazon. It's pretty much all over. I've got a link to it on my website as well, chrissanders.org, and I've got a table of contents there and some little sample tidbits and whatnot as well.
Awesome. chrissanders.org. Chris, thank you so much for coming back on Paul Security Weekly.
Always glad to be here. Thank y'all so much.
With that, we'll take a short break, come back with the security news. Stay tuned.